Baby found Mother Bear, guarding ambulance with injured driver. What she did next shocked everyone. The mountain road stretched through the pine forest like a ribbon of black asphalt, winding between towering trees that had stood sentinel for decades. On this particular morning, the mist clung to the mountainside with unusual persistence, creating a world that felt suspended between reality and dream. The air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk's cry echoed through the valley. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing more extraordinary than the gentle transition from night to day, yet the universe had other plans entirely. Connor Adams had been driving this route for 3 years as a paramedic, and he thought he knew every curve, every pothole, every scenic overlook along the way. The ambulance hummed steadily beneath him as he navigated the familiar turns, his partner Jessica Brooks checking their equipment in the back. They were returning from a routine transport, nothing urgent, just an elderly man who needed to get to the city hospital for some tests. The radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other units, but their sector remained quiet, peaceful even. "You know what I love about these mountain calls?" Jessica said, settling into the passenger seat as they rounded another bend. "The silence up here. It's like the whole world just takes a deep breath and holds it for a while." She gazed out the window at the towering pines, their branches heavy with morning dew that caught the filtered sunlight like tiny diamonds. Connor nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. After years of city emergencies, sirens, and constant noise, these mountain runs felt like a meditation, a chance to remember why they had chosen this profession in the first place. The curve ahead looked no different from the dozens they had already navigated, but something was wrong with the road surface. Connor felt the ambulance begin to slide before he fully understood what was happening. A patch of black ice, invisible in the morning light, had formed where a small stream crossed under the asphalt. The vehicle's weight shifted, and despite his years of experience, despite his quick reflexes, the laws of physics took over. The ambulance skidded sideways, struck the guardrail with a grinding screech of metal, and then rolled down the embankment into the forest below. The world turned upside down, then right side up, then upside down again. Connor felt his consciousness slip away as the ambulance came to rest against a massive pine tree, steam rising from the crumpled hood. Jessica's last coherent thought before darkness claimed her was the strange irony that they, the ones who usually came to help, now needed help themselves. The forest settled back into its morning quiet, broken only by the gentle hiss of escaping steam and the distant call of that same hawk, now circling overhead as if drawn by some ancient instinct to witness what was about to unfold. When Connor's eyes fluttered open, the first thing he noticed was the pain. His left arm felt wrong, definitely broken, and his head throbbed with the kind of intensity that suggested a serious concussion. The ambulance lay on its side, and through the spider-webbed windshield he could see Jessica hanging unconscious in her harness, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. He tried to move, to reach for the radio, to do something, anything, but his body refused to cooperate. The simple act of staying conscious required all his energy. That's when he saw her. At first, Connor thought his injured brain was playing tricks on him. Through the damaged windshield, barely 20 feet away, sat a massive brown bear. She was facing the ambulance, perfectly still, as if she had been waiting for him to wake up. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and there was something in her posture that spoke not of aggression or curiosity, but of purpose. She sat like a guardian, like a sentinel posted to watch over them, and Connor found himself staring back at her with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. The bear didn't move. she didn't pace or sniff the air or show any of the typical behaviors Connor might have expected from a wild animal encountering a crashed vehicle. Instead, she remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the ambulance with an intensity that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Connor tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but his concussed brain struggled to process the surreal scene. Bears were supposed to be afraid of humans, weren't they? They were supposed to run away from loud noises and strange smells, not sit vigil beside crashed emergency vehicles. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost all meaning in Connor's injured state. The sun climbed higher, burning away some of the mist and casting dappled shadows through the forest canopy. The bear never moved. She remained in that same position, watching, waiting, as if she understood something about their situation that Connor couldn't grasp. Jessica stirred occasionally, but didn't fully regain consciousness, and Connor found himself drifting in and out of awareness, each time opening his eyes to find that brown form still there, still watching. It was during one of these moments of semi-consciousness that Connor heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the forest. Didn't belong anywhere near a crashed ambulance guarded by a bear. It was soft, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles, but unmistakable once his brain registered what it was. A baby was crying. The sound came from somewhere behind the bear, deeper in the forest, and it was the kind of cry that spoke of hunger, of discomfort, of a small human being in need of care. Connor's professional instincts kicked in despite his injuries, despite the impossible situation he found himself in. There was a baby out there, alone, in the wilderness, and every fiber of his being as a paramedic screamed at him to help. But he couldn't move, couldn't even call out, and between him and that crying child sat several 100 pounds of wild animal. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of the crying, and for the first time since Connor had noticed her, she turned her massive head away from the ambulance. She looked back toward the source of the crying, and something passed across her features that Connor would have sworn was concern. Not the predatory interest he might have expected, but genuine, almost maternal concern. The bear rose to her feet with surprising grace for such a large animal, and Connor held his breath, certain that she was about to lumber off into the forest toward the helpless infant. Instead, she did something that defied every piece of wildlife knowledge Connor possessed. The bear moved closer to the ambulance, positioning herself between the crashed vehicle and the sound of the crying baby. She settled back down into her watchful position, but now she was facing outward, toward the forest, as if protecting both the ambulance and whatever lay beyond it. Her message was clear, even to Connor's foggy brain. Nothing would get past her to reach either the injured paramedics or the crying child. The crying continued, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there in the background of Connor's awareness. He found himself listening to it with the trained ear of someone who had responded to countless calls involving children. This wasn't the cry of a baby in immediate distress, not the sharp, panicked wailing that indicated serious injury or illness. This was the cry of discomfort, of a child who was cold or hungry, or simply wanted to be held. It was heartbreaking in its normalcy, in the way it spoke of basic human needs that weren't being met. As the morning wore on, Connor began to notice other things about their strange guardian. The bear's fur was thick and healthy, suggesting she was well fed and in good condition. There were no signs of aggression in her posture, no raised hackles or bared teeth. If anything, she seemed calm, purposeful, as if this vigil was something she had planned rather than stumbled into. Her breathing was steady and measured, and occasionally she would tilt her head slightly, as if listening to sounds that Connor's human ears couldn't detect. The most unsettling thing, though, was the way she occasionally looked back at the ambulance, making direct eye contact with Connor through the damaged windshield. In those moments, Connor felt as if he was being assessed, evaluated by an intelligence that was far more complex than he had ever imagined possible in a wild animal. The bear's eyes held no malice, no hunger, but they held something that Connor couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. As if she knew exactly who he was and why he was there. Jessica began to stir more frequently as the sun climbed higher, and Connor managed to reach across the cab to check her pulse. It was strong and steady, which was encouraging, but she still hadn't regained full consciousness. He tried the radio, but the crash had damaged the equipment beyond use. Their cell phones had no signal this deep in the mountains, and their GPS unit had been destroyed in the impact. They were completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on the hope that someone would notice their absence and send a search party. The baby's crying grew more insistent as the day progressed, and Connor found himself becoming increasingly agitated by his inability to help. Every instinct he possessed as a paramedic, as a human being, demanded that he get to that child, but his broken body and the massive bear between him and the forest made any such attempt impossible. He began to understand something of what the bear might be feeling, this sense of protective helplessness, this need to guard something precious even when you couldn't directly provide what it needed. Around midday, the crying stopped. The sudden silence was more alarming than the crying had been, and Connor felt his heart rate spike despite his weakened condition. Had something happened to the baby? Had the child simply exhausted itself and fallen asleep, or was the silence an indication of something far worse? He strained his ears, listening for any sound that might give him a clue, but the forest had returned to its normal quiet symphony of wind and bird calls. The bear, however, seemed untroubled by the silence. If anything, she appeared more relaxed, as if the cessation of crying was exactly what she had been waiting for. She remained in her protective position, but her posture suggested contentment rather than vigilance. Her ears were no longer constantly swiveling toward the forest, and she had settled more comfortably into her spot between the ambulance and whatever lay hidden among the trees. It was then that Connor noticed something that made him question his own sanity. Near the bear's front paws, partially hidden by fallen leaves and forest debris, was what appeared to be a small bundle of cloth. At first, he thought it might be trash that had blown in from the road, but as his eyes focused more clearly, he realized it was too deliberately placed, too carefully positioned to be random litter. The bundle was small, roughly the size and shape of something that might be used to wrap an infant, and it lay within easy reach of the bear's massive paws. The implications of what he was seeing began to dawn on Connor with a clarity that cut through his concussion like a blade. The crying baby, the protective bear, the carefully placed bundle. This wasn't a random encounter between a wild animal and a crashed ambulance. This was something else entirely. Something that challenged every assumption he had about the natural world and the boundaries between species. The bear wasn't just guarding them from some perceived threat. She was guarding something specific, something precious, something that connected her to the human world in ways that shouldn't have been possible. As if sensing his realization, the bear turned to look at him again, and this time Connor was certain he saw something like approval in her dark eyes. She had been waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to see what was really happening here. This wasn't about a wild animal's territorial instincts or predatory behavior. This was about something far more profound, something that spoke to connections that existed beyond the boundaries of species and understanding. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine needles, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. The bear remained at her post, patient and watchful, while Connor drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he woke, she was still there, still guarding, still waiting. Jessica's condition seemed stable, and Connor found himself oddly comforted by their unusual protector's presence. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible situation they had stumbled into, he was beginning to believe that they were safer with the bear than they would have been without her. As evening approached, Connor heard the distant sound of helicopters. Search and rescue teams were finally looking for them, following the route they should have taken back to the city. The sound grew closer, and Connor tried to summon the energy to signal somehow, to let the searchers know where they were. But before he could act, something extraordinary happened. The bear stood up, looked once more at the ambulance and its occupants, then picked up the small bundle in her mouth with the gentleness of a mother carrying her own cub. She turned toward the deeper forest, paused for a moment as if saying goodbye, then disappeared into the shadows between the trees. Connor watched her go with a sense of loss that surprised him, as if he was losing not just their protector, but a connection to something mysterious and profound that he might never encounter again. The helicopters found them 20 minutes later, and the rescue operation proceeded with the efficient professionalism that Connor knew well from his own experience. As the paramedics worked to stabilize him and Jessica for transport, Connor tried to tell them about the bear, about the baby, about the impossible vigil that had kept them safe through the long day. But his words came out confused and disjointed, the product of concussion and shock, and he could see in their eyes that they thought he was hallucinating. Only when they were loading him into the rescue helicopter did Connor see something that made him certain his experience had been real. There, pressed into the soft earth where the bear had been sitting, was a perfect paw print. And beside it, barely visible in the fading light, was a small impression in the ground where something round and soft had rested. The bundle had been real. The baby had been real. And somewhere in the vast wilderness below, a mystery was walking deeper into the forest, carrying secrets that Connor might never understand. As the helicopter lifted off and the forest fell away beneath them, Connor found himself thinking not about his injuries or the crash, but about the bear's eyes and the intelligence he had seen there. He thought about the crying baby and the careful way the bear had positioned herself as protector. Most of all, he thought about the bundle of cloth and what it might have contained, what precious cargo their guardian had been protecting throughout that long, impossible day. The forest grew smaller below them, but Connor's questions only grew larger. Who had been crying in those woods? Why had a wild bear appointed herself as protector of both the infant and the crashed ambulance? And what had happened during those quiet moments when the crying stopped, when the bear seemed to know that her vigil was nearly complete? These questions would follow Connor through his recovery, through the long nights when he lay awake trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. Jessica recovered more quickly than Connor, her injuries proving less severe than initially feared. When she was finally able to discuss the crash coherently, she had no memory of the bear or the crying baby. Her last clear recollection was of the ambulance beginning to slide on the ice, and her next was of waking up in the hospital. Connor's account of their forest guardian remained uncorroborated, adding to the medical team's conviction that it had been a hallucination brought on by his head injury. But Connor knew what he had seen, what he had experienced during those hours in the forest. The bear had been real, the crying baby had been real, and the connection between them had been something that transcended normal understanding. As he began his physical therapy and worked to regain full use of his injured arm, Connor found himself researching everything he could find about bear behavior, about unusual animal-human interactions, about cases where wild creatures had acted in ways that defied scientific explanation. What he found were scattered reports, isolated incidents that most people dismissed as folklore or misidentification. Stories of bears that had led lost hikers to safety, of wild animals that had protected human children, of connections between species that couldn't be explained by conventional biology. The reports were rare, often lacking corroboration, but they shared common elements that resonated with Connor's own experience. Intelligence beyond what should have been possible, protective behavior that seemed to transcend instinct, and always the sense that something deeper was at work, something that connected the human and animal worlds in ways that science hadn't yet learned to measure. 3 weeks after the accident, Connor returned to work on light duty. He found himself thinking constantly about the forest, about the bear, about the mystery that had unfolded during those hours when he had been helpless and dependent on the protection of a creature that should have seen him as either prey or threat. The questions haunted him, but so did something else. A sense of gratitude, of having been touched by something extraordinary, something that had changed his understanding of what was possible in the world. It was Jessica who finally suggested they return to the crash site. She had been having dreams, she told Connor, dreams of a forest guardian and a crying child, dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. Despite having no conscious recollection of the bear, something in her subconscious had retained the experience, and she found herself as curious as Connor about what had really happened during those lost hours. The Forest Service had cleared the ambulance wreckage weeks earlier, but the site was still identifiable by the broken trees and scarred earth where the vehicle had come to rest. Connor and Jessica stood in the clearing, looking around at the peaceful forest scene, trying to reconcile the tranquil setting with the drama that had unfolded there. Birds sang in the canopy above, and a gentle breeze stirred the pine needles, creating the same whispering sound that Connor remembered from his vigil. It was Jessica who found the first clue that Connor's experience had been more than hallucination. Partially buried under fallen leaves, she discovered a small piece of blue fabric, soft and worn, the kind of material that might be used to wrap an infant. The fabric was clean, recently placed, not weathered by seasons in the forest. Connor held it in his hands, feeling vindicated but also more puzzled than ever. If the baby and the bundle had been real, where were they now? What had happened to the child that the bear had been protecting? They searched the area thoroughly, looking for any other evidence of the mysterious infant or its protector. What they found instead was a trail, barely visible to untrained eyes but unmistakable once they learned to look for it. Broken twigs at just the right height, disturbed earth showing the passage of something large and heavy, tufts of brown fur caught on thorny bushes. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from the road, toward the heart of the wilderness where few humans ever ventured. Connor and Jessica followed the trail for nearly an hour, moving slowly and carefully through the underbrush. The path wound through dense stands of pine and fir, across small streams, and up rocky slopes that would have been challenging for anyone carrying a burden. Yet the trail continued, purposeful and determined, as if their mysterious bear had known exactly where she was going and why. The trail ended at a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees, their trunks so massive that it would have taken several people holding hands to encircle them. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins of an old cabin, its walls weathered gray by decades of mountain weather. The roof had partially collapsed, and wild vines had begun to reclaim the structure, but it was clear that someone had once called this remote place home. Near the cabin's entrance, Connor found another paw print in the soft earth, and beside it, the same small circular impression he had noticed at the crash site. Whatever the bear had been carrying, she had brought it here, to this forgotten homestead deep in the forest. But why? What connection could there be between a wild animal and this abandoned human dwelling? Jessica was exploring the cabin's interior when she called out in excitement. Among the debris of fallen timbers and accumulated leaves, she had found something that made Connor's heart race. A wooden crib, handmade and carefully crafted, sat in what had once been a corner of the main room. The crib was old but well preserved, protected from the weather by the cabin's partially intact walls. And inside the crib, arranged with obvious care, was a collection of items that spoke of recent use. There were baby clothes, clean and neatly folded, cloth diapers, soft blankets, a few simple toys carved from wood. Everything an infant might need for basic care, all of it placed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested love and planning. Most remarkably, the items showed no signs of weather damage or animal interference. They had been protected, cared for, maintained by someone or something that understood their importance. Connor picked up one of the wooden toys, a simple rattle carved in the shape of a bear. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the work of someone with both skill and patience. On the bottom of the toy, carved in small, careful letters, was a name, Sarah. The same name appeared on several of the other items embroidered on blankets carved into the wooden crib rail, written in faded ink on the spine of a small book of lullabies. As they continued to explore the cabin, Connor and Jessica began to piece together the story of whoever had lived in this remote place. There were photographs, water-damaged but still recognizable, showing a young woman with kind eyes and gentle smile. In some of the pictures, she was holding a baby, and in others she was standing beside the same massive brown bear that had guarded their ambulance. The woman and the bear together, not as strangers or adversaries, but as companions, as family. The photographs told a story that challenged everything Connor thought he knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Here was clear evidence of a bond that transcended species, a connection so deep that it had survived even after the human half of the partnership was gone. For it was clear, from the abandoned state of the cabin and the age of the photographs, that the woman named Sarah was no longer living in this remote sanctuary. In a wooden box beneath the crib, Jessica found a journal, its pages yellowed with age but its words still legible. The entries were written in the same careful hand that had carved the baby's name into the toys, and they told a story that explained everything Connor had witnessed at the crash site. Sarah had lived alone in the forest for years, caring for a baby that wasn't biologically hers, but had become hers in every way that mattered, and she had shared her life with a bear she called Luna, a creature she had rescued as an orphaned cub and raised alongside the human child. The journal entries painted a picture of an unconventional family, bound together not by blood or species but by love and mutual dependence. Sarah had been a nurse before she came to the mountains, and her medical knowledge had helped her care for both the baby and the bear. Luna had grown into a powerful adult, but had never lost her connection to the humans who had raised her. The three of them had lived together in harmony, isolated from the world but complete in their unusual bond. The final entries in the journal were dated just weeks before Connor and Jessica's accident. Sarah had been ill, growing weaker despite her medical knowledge and Luna's devoted care. She knew she was dying, and her greatest concern was not for herself but for the baby and the bear she would leave behind. The last entry was brief but heartbreaking. Luna understands. She knows what she must do. I've taught her to recognize the sound of help coming, to know when it's safe to trust. She'll keep Sarah safe until the right people come. She promises. Connor closed the journal with shaking hands, finally understanding what he had witnessed in the forest. Luna hadn't been guarding them from some random protective instinct. She had been fulfilling a promise made to a dying woman, keeping watch over a human baby until help arrived in the form of other humans who could provide the care that a bear, no matter how devoted, could never give. The crash had been coincidental, but Luna had recognized in Connor and Jessica the help that Sarah had told her would eventually come. The baby, Sarah, was nowhere to be found in the cabin, but Connor wasn't worried. If Luna had been caring for the child for weeks, if she had been waiting for the right moment to transfer that responsibility to human hands, then the infant was safe. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, or perhaps already in the care of the authorities who had responded to some other call, little Sarah was beginning a new chapter of her life, protected and loved as her adoptive mother had intended. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Connor felt a presence watching them from the forest. He turned toward the tree line and saw her there, magnificent and patient as ever. Luna sat among the shadows, observing their discovery of her secret, gauging their reaction to the truth she had protected for so long. In her dark eyes, Connor saw not the wild intelligence he had noticed before, but something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of a promise kept, a duty fulfilled. Connor raised his hand in a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, and for a moment he could have sworn that Luna nodded in return. Then she turned and disappeared into the forest, her massive form moving with surprising grace through the undergrowth. Connor knew he would never see her again, but he also knew that somewhere in these mountains she would continue her vigil, continue protecting the wild places and the creatures who called them home. The hike back to their vehicle gave Connor and Jessica time to process what they had discovered, to try to make sense of a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. They had stumbled into the final chapter of an extraordinary tale, a story of love that transcended species and death itself. Luna had kept her promise to Sarah, had protected baby Sarah until the right help arrived, and had trusted two injured strangers with the most precious thing in her world. When they reached the road, Connor called the authorities to report their discovery of the abandoned cabin and the evidence of a missing child. The investigation that followed confirmed what they had pieced together from the journal and photographs. Sarah Mitchell had been a former pediatric nurse who had disappeared into the mountains years earlier, taking with her a baby she had been fostering. The authorities had assumed both had perished in the wilderness, but Connor and Jessica's discovery revealed a far more complex and beautiful truth. Baby Sarah was found 3 days later, healthy and well cared for, in the temporary custody of a park ranger who had discovered her in a basket outside his station. The ranger reported that he had been awakened by what sounded like someone gently placing something on his porch, but when he investigated, he found only the baby and a note written in Sarah Mitchell's careful handwriting. Her name is Sarah. She is loved. Please find her a family who will understand that love comes in many forms. The adoption process was complicated by the unusual circumstances of Sarah's discovery, but Connor found himself deeply invested in the outcome. He and Jessica visited the child regularly during the legal proceedings, feeling a connection to her that went beyond their role in her rescue. They had been part of her story from the moment Luna had chosen to trust them with her secret, and they felt responsible for ensuring that the final chapter was as beautiful as the rest of the tale. 6 months later, Connor and Jessica stood in a courthouse, holding hands as a judge finalized the adoption papers that made them Sarah's legal parents. The little girl who had been protected by a bear, raised by a woman who understood that family was about love rather than biology, would now grow up with parents who had been chosen for her by the most unusual matchmaker imaginable. Luna had brought them together, had recognized in two injured strangers the capacity to love and protect the child she could no longer care for alone. As they left the courthouse with their new daughter, Connor looked up at the mountains visible in the distance and thought about Luna, still out there somewhere, still keeping her vigil over the wild places. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, whose love had transcended death itself, creating bonds that connected human and animal, past and future, in ways that defied explanation. And he thought about the baby in his arms, who would grow up knowing that she had been loved by a woman, protected by a bear, and chosen by fate to be part of a story that proved love truly could conquer all boundaries. The forest kept its secrets, but it had shared one of its most precious with Connor and Jessica. As they drove home with their new daughter, Connor knew that their lives had been changed not just by becoming parents, but by witnessing something that most people would never believe. They had seen love in its purest form, had been trusted with a miracle, and had become part of a story that would continue for generations to come. In the years that followed, Connor would often take Sarah hiking in the mountains, teaching her about the forest and the creatures that lived there. He would tell her stories about her first mother, about the woman who had loved her enough to trust her care to a bear, and about Luna, who had kept watch over her until the right family could be found. Sarah would listen with wide eyes, understanding somehow that her story was different, special, touched by magic that most children could only dream about. And sometimes, when they were deep in the forest and the light was just right, Connor would catch a glimpse of brown fur moving through the shadows, of dark eyes watching from a distance. Luna was still out there, still protecting, still keeping the promises she had made to a dying woman. The forest was her domain, but the child she had helped to save was thriving in the human world, surrounded by love and growing stronger every day. The bond between human and animal, between past and present, between love and sacrifice, continued to weave its magic through their lives. Connor and Jessica had learned that family could be created in the most unexpected ways, that love could bridge any gap, and that sometimes the most important promises were kept not by words, but by actions, not by humans, but by creatures whose hearts were large enough to hold the whole world. As Sarah grew older, she would sometimes ask about the bear who had protected her, about the woman who had been her first mother, about the accident that had brought her parents into her life. Connor would answer her questions as best he could, but he knew that the full truth of her story was something she would have to discover for herself, something that would unfold as she grew and learned to understand the complex web of love and fate that had shaped her earliest days. The story was far from over. It continued every day in the love between Connor, Jessica, and Sarah, in the lessons they learned about family and sacrifice, in the knowledge that somewhere in the mountains Luna still kept her vigil. The forest had given them a gift beyond measure, and they would spend the rest of their lives proving worthy of that trust, honoring the memory of Sarah Mitchell and the promise of the bear who had brought them all together. Chapter 2. The Whispering Woods. The weeks following their return to the abandoned cabin had settled into Connor and Jessica's lives like ripples spreading across still water. Each day brought new questions about what they had witnessed, new attempts to understand the extraordinary bond between Sarah Mitchell, Luna, and the baby who was now legally their daughter. But it was the forest itself that seemed to hold the deepest mysteries. And as autumn deepened into the kind of crisp clarity that made the mountains look like they were carved from crystal, Connor found himself drawn back to those whispering woods with an intensity that surprised him. Jessica had returned to work full-time, her recovery complete and her confidence restored. But Connor still found himself on modified duty, his broken arm healing slower than expected. The physical therapy sessions were progressing well, but his doctor had recommended against returning to full paramedic duties until his strength was completely restored. This forced period of reduced activity gave Connor time to think, time to research, and time to make frequent trips back to the forest where their lives had been so dramatically changed. On this particular morning, Connor drove the familiar mountain road with baby Sarah sleeping peacefully in her car seat behind him. At 8 months old, she was a remarkably calm child, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unusual focus. Connor had noticed that she was always most peaceful when they were in the mountains, as if something in the forest air called to her in ways that the city never could. Today's trip was different from their usual casual visits. Connor had a specific destination in mind, a place he had been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't yet found the courage to explore. The morning mist clung to the mountainsides with the persistence of early winter, creating a world that felt suspended between seasons. Connor parked at the same spot where he and Jessica had begun their investigation weeks earlier, but instead of hiking directly to Sarah Mitchell's cabin, he planned to follow a different trail, one that had been mentioned in the journal but which they had never explored. According to Sarah's careful notes, there was another structure deeper in the forest, a place she referred to only as the Sanctuary, where she had first encountered Luna as an orphaned cub. Connor secured Sarah in a hiking carrier designed for infants, making sure she was warm and comfortable for the journey ahead. The baby seemed to sense that this was a special expedition, remaining alert but quiet as they set off into the forest. The trail was barely visible, more of a deer path than anything designed for human use, but Connor's weeks of studying Sarah Mitchell's journal had taught him to recognize the subtle markers she had used to navigate these wild places. The forest seemed different today, more alive somehow, as if the approaching winter had awakened something in the trees and wildlife that had been dormant during the warmer months. Connor could hear the distant calls of migrating birds, the rustle of small animals preparing for the cold months ahead, and underneath it all, a sound that he had learned to associate with these mountains, a gentle whispering that seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if the forest were sharing secrets with anyone patient enough to listen. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following the faint trail through stands of pine and aspen, Connor found himself thinking about the journal entries he had read and reread over the past weeks. Sarah Mitchell's writing had revealed a woman of extraordinary sensitivity, someone who had learned to read the forest like a book, understanding its moods and rhythms with an intimacy that most people never achieved with other humans. Her descriptions of Luna's early days painted a picture of a relationship that had begun with rescue, but had evolved into something far more profound. According to the journal, Sarah had found Luna as a tiny cub, barely a few weeks old, beside the body of her mother who had been killed by a late spring avalanche. The normal protocol would have been to contact wildlife authorities, to have the cub relocated to a rehabilitation facility and eventually released back into the wild. But something about the tiny bear had touched Sarah's heart in ways that transcended protocol and common sense. She had brought the cub home, intending to care for her only until proper authorities could be contacted, but days had turned into weeks, weeks into months, and gradually Luna had become not just a rescued animal, but a member of Sarah's unconventional family. The trail began to level out as they reached a broad plateau, and Connor could see evidence of the sanctuary that Sarah had written about with such reverence. Ahead of them, nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by ancient trees, stood a structure unlike anything Connor had expected. It wasn't a building in any conventional sense, but rather a series of interconnected shelters built into and around the living trees themselves. Wooden platforms had been constructed between massive trunks, connected by bridges and walkways that seemed to grow organically from the forest itself. The entire complex had been designed to blend seamlessly with the natural environment, using materials that had been gathered from the forest floor rather than brought in from outside. Fallen logs had been shaped into walls, pine boughs woven into roofs, and stone, gathered from nearby streams, had been used to create foundations that seemed to emerge naturally from the earth. The result was a dwelling that felt less like human construction and more like something the forest had grown to shelter its most precious inhabitants. Connor approached the sanctuary with the same reverence he might have felt entering a cathedral. This was clearly a sacred space, a place where the boundary between human and natural worlds had been deliberately blurred until it became meaningless. Baby Sarah stirred in her carrier, making soft cooing sounds as if she recognized something familiar about their surroundings. Connor wondered if some memory, some genetic echo of her earliest days, was responding to the forest environment that had been her first home. The main platform was larger than the others, clearly designed as a central living space, and as Connor climbed the sturdy wooden steps that led up to it, he could see evidence of recent use. The structure was weathered but well-maintained, as if someone had been caring for it long after Sarah Mitchell's death. Blankets were neatly folded in one corner. Cooking utensils were arranged beside a fire pit that showed signs of recent use, and most remarkably, fresh pine boughs had been woven into the roof structure, their green needles still fragrant with forest scent. Connor set down the baby carrier and began to explore the platform more thoroughly. What he found there challenged his understanding of what had happened in these mountains even more than the journal entries had. This wasn't an abandoned structure slowly being reclaimed by nature. This was an active dwelling, a place that was still being used and maintained by someone or something that understood its importance. But who could be living here, so deep in the wilderness, so far from any human habitation? The answer came to him gradually as he examined the evidence more carefully. The blankets were arranged in a way that suggested they had been used recently, but they showed signs of wear that spoke of careful, almost reverent handling. The cooking area contained utensils that were clean, but showed the kind of wear that came from years of regular use. Most telling of all, there were toys scattered around the platform, the same kind of hand-carved wooden toys they had found in baby Sarah's crib at the abandoned cabin. Connor picked up one of the toys, a small wooden bear that was identical to the one they had discovered weeks earlier. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, the work of the same hands that had created all of baby Sarah's possessions. But how could that be? Sarah Mitchell had been dead for months, and there was no evidence that anyone else had been living in these mountains. Unless... The realization hit Connor with a force that made him sit down heavily on one of the wooden benches that surrounded the fire pit. The toys, the maintained structure, the fresh pine boughs, the carefully arranged blankets. Someone had been living here, caring for this place, keeping it ready for the return of the child who had once called it home. But not someone, something. Luna had been maintaining the sanctuary, keeping it as a shrine to the family she had lost, preparing it for a reunion that she somehow knew would eventually come. Baby Sarah had begun to fuss in her carrier, and Connor lifted her out, holding her against his chest as he tried to process what he was discovering. The little girl immediately calmed, her dark eyes taking in the forest canopy above them with the same focused attention she always showed in natural settings. Connor found himself wondering what she was seeing, what memories or instincts might be stirring in her young mind as she experienced the place that had been her first home. As if summoned by his thoughts, Connor heard a sound that made his heart race with recognition. Somewhere in the forest around them, something large was moving through the underbrush, approaching the sanctuary with the careful, measured steps that Connor remembered from his vigil beside the crashed ambulance. He looked around quickly, assessing their situation, but realized that there was nowhere to run and no point in trying. If Luna had found them here in the heart of her territory, then she had allowed them to come this far for a reason. She emerged from the tree line with the same quiet dignity that Connor remembered, her massive form moving with surprising grace as she approached the sanctuary. But this time was different. This time, Luna showed no hesitation, no caution about approaching humans. She walked directly to the base of the platform where Connor sat holding baby Sarah, and for the first time, Connor could see her clearly in full daylight, without the barrier of a damaged windshield between them. Luna was magnificent. Her brown fur was thick and healthy, showing the kind of condition that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the forest. Her eyes held the same intelligence that Connor remembered, but now he could see something else there as well. Recognition. Not just of him as the injured human she had once protected, but of the baby in his arms as the child she had helped to raise. Luna had come to the sanctuary not to confront intruders, but to check on the welfare of the little girl who had once been part of her family. Connor held his breath as Luna approached the platform, but the bear showed no signs of aggression. Instead, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something precious and fragile. When she reached the edge of the platform, she sat back on her haunches and simply looked at baby Sarah, her massive head tilted slightly to one side in an expression that Connor could only describe as tender. Baby Sarah, for her part, showed no fear of the enormous creature watching her. If anything, she seemed fascinated, reaching out with tiny hands toward Luna as if trying to touch something familiar and comforting. The baby made soft cooing sounds, the kind of contented noises she usually reserved for Connor and Jessica, and Connor realized that on some level, Sarah recognized Luna as family, as someone who had been part of her earliest experiences of love and protection. The three of them remained in that tableau for several minutes, human and bear and baby, connected by bonds that transcended species and conventional understanding. Connor felt a peace settle over him that he had never experienced before, a sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. This wasn't a chance encounter or a dangerous wildlife situation. This was a reunion, a moment of connection between members of a family that had been separated by circumstances but never truly broken. Luna finally moved, but not in the way Connor might have expected. Instead of approaching the platform, she turned and walked to a large tree at the edge of the clearing, one whose trunk showed signs of having been deliberately modified. Carved into the bark, at a height that would have been easily reachable for a human but challenging for most animals, was a series of symbols that Connor recognized from Sarah Mitchell's journal. They were markers, he realized, indicators of hidden caches where supplies and important items had been stored. Following Luna's obvious invitation, Connor climbed down from the platform, still carrying baby Sarah, and approached the marked tree. At its base, partially hidden by fallen leaves and forest debris, was a wooden box similar to the one they had found at the cabin. This one, however, was larger and showed signs of more recent handling. The wood was clean, free of the weathering that would have accumulated over months of exposure to the elements. Connor opened the box carefully, not sure what to expect, but certain that whatever Luna was showing him was important. Inside, wrapped in the same soft cloth that had been used for baby Sarah's other possessions, was a collection of items that told a story Connor was only beginning to understand. There were more photographs, these showing Sarah Mitchell, Luna, and baby Sarah together in various locations around the sanctuary. The pictures captured moments of extraordinary intimacy. Sarah nursing the baby, while Luna dozed nearby, the bear gently nuzzling the infant while Sarah watched with obvious love, all three of them sleeping together on the platform during what appeared to be a warm summer evening. But it was the other items in the box that truly amazed Connor. There was a detailed map of the forest, hand-drawn with the kind of precision that spoke of years of careful exploration. The map showed not just the locations of the cabin and the sanctuary, but dozens of other sites scattered throughout the wilderness. Caves that could provide shelter during storms, streams that ran clean year-round, meadows where edible plants grew in abundance, and most intriguingly, locations marked with symbols that Connor didn't recognize but which seemed to indicate places of special significance. Beneath the map was another journal, this one smaller than the first, but filled with the same careful handwriting. As Connor flipped through its pages, he realized that this was Sarah Mitchell's record of Luna's education, a detailed account of how she had taught the bear to understand human needs, human schedules, and most importantly, human signals for help and danger. The entries revealed a systematic program of training that had gone far beyond simple animal conditioning, creating a level of communication between human and bear that challenged everything Connor thought he knew about interspecies relationships. The final item in the box was a letter, sealed in an envelope that bore Connor's name in Sarah Mitchell's careful script. Connor stared at the envelope in amazement, wondering how Sarah could possibly have known his name, could have anticipated that he would be the one to find this hidden cache. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began to read words that had been written months before he had ever heard of Sarah Mitchell or Luna or the baby who was now his daughter. "Dear Connor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Luna has brought you to the sanctuary, and my plan has worked better than I dared to hope. You are probably wondering how I know your name, how I could have anticipated that you would be the one to find this letter. The answer is simple. Luna told me about you, in the way that she tells me about all the important things in our forest. She has been watching you for months, learning about you, understanding who you are, and what kind of person you might become. When I realized that my time was running short, I asked her to choose someone who could care for Sarah the way she deserved to be cared for, and she chose you." Connor looked up from the letter to find Luna watching him intently, as if waiting for his reaction to this revelation. The idea that he had been under observation for months, that his character and suitability as a parent had been evaluated by a bear, was almost too extraordinary to accept. Yet the evidence was right there in his hands, written in the careful script of a woman who had trusted her most precious possessions to the judgment of a creature that most people would consider incapable of such complex reasoning. The letter continued. "By now, you have probably discovered that Luna is not an ordinary bear, just as Sarah is not an ordinary baby, and I was not an ordinary woman. We are connected by something that goes deeper than biology or species, something that I have spent years trying to understand and have finally learned to simply accept. Love, it turns out, is not limited by the boundaries that we think separate us from the natural world. It flows wherever it is needed, creating families and bonds that exist outside of conventional understanding." Baby Sarah had fallen asleep in Connor's arms, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest and the warmth of his embrace. Connor looked down at her peaceful face and then back at Luna, who continued to watch them with patient attention. The bear's expression was impossible to read in human terms, but Connor sensed approval there, satisfaction at seeing the child she had helped to protect safe and loved in the arms of the person she had chosen to be Sarah's new parent. "The sanctuary has been Luna's project from the beginning," the letter explained. "She understood, long before I did, that our little family might not last forever in its original form. She began preparing this place as a refuge, somewhere that Sarah could always return to if she needed to remember where she came from, who she had been before she became part of the human world. Luna will maintain it for as long as she lives, keeping it ready for Sarah's return, keeping alive the memory of the love that brought us all together." Connor folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had learned. Luna hadn't just been a wild animal that had formed an unusual bond with humans. She had been an active participant in planning for Sarah's future, preparing for contingencies that even Sarah Mitchell hadn't fully anticipated. The bear's intelligence and emotional capacity were far beyond anything that conventional science recognized as possible. As if responding to his thoughts, Luna rose from her sitting position and approached the platform again. This time, she climbed the steps with careful deliberation, her massive weight causing the wooden structure to creak but never threatening its stability. Connor watched in amazement as Luna moved around the platform, checking various items, adjusting the arrangement of blankets, ensuring that everything was exactly as it should be for the comfort and safety of any future occupants. The bear's behavior was so deliberately purposeful, so obviously the result of planning and forethought, that Connor found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence. Luna wasn't acting on instinct or simple conditioning. She was demonstrating reasoning ability, emotional complexity, and planning capacity that rivaled or exceeded that of many humans Connor had known. The sanctuary wasn't just a shelter. It was a testament to love that transcended the boundaries between species. Luna completed her inspection of the platform and returned to where Connor sat with sleeping Sarah. The bear settled down beside them, close enough that Connor could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body, but careful not to make any movement that might disturb the sleeping child. For several minutes, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light filter through the forest canopy and listening to the gentle sounds of the wilderness around them. It was during this peaceful interlude that Connor began to notice details about the sanctuary that he had missed during his initial exploration. The wooden structures weren't just functional, they were beautiful, decorated with carvings that showed the same artistic skill evident in baby Sarah's toys. The carvings depicted scenes from forest life, bears and deer, eagles and mountain streams, all rendered with a level of detail that spoke of patient observation and deep love for the natural world. Most remarkably, some of the carvings showed human figures integrated seamlessly into the forest scenes. A woman gathering berries while a bear watched protectively nearby. A baby sleeping peacefully while forest animals stood guard around her. A family of 3, 2 humans and a bear, sharing a meal beside a mountain stream. The carvings told the story of Sarah Mitchell's unconventional family, preserving in wood the memories of a life lived in harmony with the wilderness. As the afternoon wore on, Connor found himself drawn into a state of meditation unlike anything he had ever experienced. The combination of the forest setting, Luna's peaceful presence, and the sleeping weight of baby Sarah in his arms created a sense of connection to something larger than himself. He began to understand what Sarah Mitchell had meant when she wrote about love that transcended boundaries, about families that formed outside the normal rules of biology and species. Luna seemed to sense his growing understanding and began to move around the sanctuary in a way that Connor gradually realized was educational. She was showing him things, teaching him about the place that had been Sarah's first home, ensuring that he understood its significance and his responsibility to preserve its meaning. The bear led him to food caches hidden in hollow trees, to water sources that ran clean even during dry seasons, to shelter areas that could provide protection during severe weather. Each location was marked with the same symbols that appeared on Sarah Mitchell's map, and Connor began to understand that he was being initiated into a knowledge system that had been developed over years of careful observation and planning. Luna wasn't just showing him around her territory. She was passing on information that might be crucial for Sarah's future welfare, ensuring that the child would always have a safe haven to return to if the human world failed to provide what she needed. The most remarkable demonstration came when Luna led Connor to a large tree at the edge of the sanctuary, one whose trunk showed extensive modification. Carved steps had been cut into the bark, leading up to a platform built high in the branches. Luna began to climb, moving with surprising agility for such a large animal, and Connor realized that she was inviting him to follow. With baby Sarah secure in her carrier, Connor made the climb, trusting in Luna's judgment about what was safe and important for him to see. The platform in the treetops offered a view of the forest that took Connor's breath away. From this vantage point, he could see for miles in every direction, taking in the vast wilderness that had been Sarah Mitchell's world and Luna's domain. But more than just a scenic overlook, the platform served a practical purpose that became clear as Connor examined the equipment stored there. There was a telescope for long-distance observation, signal mirrors for communication, and most importantly, a detailed logbook that recorded the movements and activities of everything that happened in the forest below. The log entries were written in Sarah Mitchell's hand, but they covered a period that extended far beyond her death. Connor realized that Luna had been continuing the observations, somehow communicating her findings to Sarah, who had recorded them until her final illness made such activities impossible. The entries revealed a level of forest management and wildlife monitoring that rivaled anything done by professional naturalists, all of it carried out by a woman and a bear working in partnership. As Connor flipped through the logbook, he found entries that mentioned his own visits to the forest, his trips with Jessica to investigate the crash site, his recent excursions with baby Sarah. Luna had been watching them all along, evaluating their behavior, assessing their suitability as Sarah's new family. The bear's judgment had been careful and thorough, based on months of observation rather than the single dramatic encounter at the crash site. The final entries in the logbook were the most remarkable of all. They were written in a different hand, shakier and less controlled than Sarah Mitchell's usual careful script, clearly the product of her final illness. But the content was extraordinary. Detailed instructions for Luna about how to care for baby Sarah if something happened to Sarah herself, how to recognize appropriate help when it arrived, and most importantly, how to ensure that the child's transition to a new family would preserve the most important elements of what she had learned during her time in the forest. Luna will know when the right people come, the final entry read. She has been preparing for this possibility for months, learning to recognize the signs of people who understand that love comes in many forms, who can accept that Sarah's story is more complex than most children's stories, who can honor the bond between human and animal that has shaped her earliest experiences. Trust Luna's judgment. She sees more clearly than any of us. Connor closed the logbook and looked out over the forest, trying to absorb the full implications of what he had discovered. Luna hadn't just been protecting baby Sarah during those hours at the crash site. She had been implementing a carefully planned strategy developed over months of preparation. The bear had evaluated Connor and Jessica not just during their moment of crisis, but through extended observation of their character and behavior in various circumstances. The afternoon was beginning to fade into evening when Luna finally led Connor back down from the treetop platform. Baby Sarah had awakened and was beginning to show signs of hunger, reminding Connor that despite the extraordinary nature of their visit to the sanctuary, he still had practical responsibilities as a parent. Luna seemed to understand this as well, moving purposefully toward a section of the sanctuary that Connor hadn't yet explored. What he found there was perhaps the most touching evidence yet of Luna's intelligence and emotional capacity. Hidden beneath a carefully constructed shelter was a complete baby care station, equipped with everything needed for feeding, changing, and comforting an infant. The supplies were clean and well maintained, clearly prepared for exactly this kind of visit. Luna had anticipated that Connor might bring Sarah back to the sanctuary, and had made provisions for her comfort and care. As Connor fed baby Sarah and changed her diaper using supplies that Luna had thoughtfully provided, he found himself overwhelmed by the depth of planning and caring that had gone into preparing for this moment. The bear had thought of everything, from practical necessities to emotional needs, ensuring that Sarah's return to her first home would be comfortable and meaningful. It was a level of consideration and foresight that challenged every assumption Connor had ever made about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. The feeding and changing process gave Connor time to observe Luna more closely, and what he saw convinced him that he was in the presence of something truly extraordinary. The bear's attention to baby Sarah was focused and tender, her massive head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening not just to the child's sounds, but to something deeper, some form of communication that existed below the level of human perception. Luna's responses to Sarah's needs were immediate and appropriate, demonstrating a level of understanding that went far beyond simple animal behavior. When baby Sarah had been fed and made comfortable, Luna approached Connor with obvious purpose. The bear moved to a section of the platform where several items had been carefully arranged, and Connor realized that this was another gift, another piece of the puzzle that Luna was helping him to understand. Among the items was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with images of the forest and its inhabitants. Inside the box, Connor found a collection of items that told the final chapter of Sarah Mitchell's story. There were letters addressed to baby Sarah, to be opened at various stages of her life. Letters for her first birthday, her first day of school, her graduation, her wedding day. Each envelope was carefully labeled and sealed, containing Sarah Mitchell's hopes and wisdom for the daughter she had loved but would never see grow up. The letters were a mother's attempt to remain present in her child's life despite the finality of death, a way of ensuring that love would continue to guide and protect long after its original source was gone. But perhaps the most precious item in the box was a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Inside the locket was a photograph of Sarah Mitchell, holding baby Sarah, with the Luna sitting protectively beside them. On the back of the photograph, in Sarah's careful handwriting, were the words, "Love has no boundaries. Family has no limits. Home is wherever we are together." It was a message that captured the essence of everything Connor had learned during his visits to the forest, a philosophy that had guided Sarah Mitchell's unconventional life and would now guide baby Sarah's future. Connor fastened the locket around baby Sarah's neck, and the child immediately reached for it with tiny fingers, as if recognizing something familiar and precious. Luna watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction, her massive head nodding slightly in what Connor could only interpret as approval. The bear had successfully completed another phase of her mission, ensuring that Sarah would grow up with tangible reminders of her origins and the love that had shaped her earliest days. As evening deepened into night, Connor realized that their visit to the sanctuary was drawing to a close. Luna had shown him everything she wanted him to see, had shared all the secrets she was ready to reveal, and had ensured that he understood his responsibilities as Sarah's new guardian. The bear began to move around the sanctuary in a way that suggested preparation for departure, checking various items and making small adjustments that would preserve the site until the next visit. Connor packed up baby Sarah and prepared for the hike back to their vehicle, but Luna had one final gift to share. The bear led them to a path that Connor hadn't noticed during their arrival, one that was wider and better maintained than the route they had taken to reach the sanctuary. This path, Connor realized, was Luna's creation, a route designed specifically for humans carrying precious cargo, a way for Sarah and her new family to return safely to the sanctuary whenever they needed to reconnect with her origins. The hike down the mountain was peaceful and contemplative, with Luna accompanying them partway before disappearing into the forest with her characteristic quiet dignity. Connor found himself thinking about everything he had learned, everything he had experienced, and everything he now understood about the extraordinary circumstances that had brought baby Sarah into his and Jessica's lives. The forest had given them more than a child. It had given them a new understanding of what family could be, what love could accomplish. and what connections were possible between the human and natural worlds. When Connor finally reached his vehicle and secured baby Sarah in her car seat, he looked back toward the forest one last time. Somewhere in those shadows, Luna was continuing her vigil, maintaining the sanctuary, preserving the memory of a love that had transcended every boundary that humans thought separated them from the natural world. The bear would be there whenever Sarah needed to return, whenever she needed to remember where she had come from and who had loved her first. As they drove down the mountain road toward home, Connor felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced before. The mystery that had begun with a crashed ambulance and a guardian bear had revealed itself to be something far more beautiful and complex than he had ever imagined. It was a story of love that refused to be limited by species or death, of family that formed outside conventional boundaries, and of connections that would endure for generations to come. Baby Sarah slept peacefully in her car seat, the silver locket catching the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the trees. In her dreams, Connor imagined she was back in the sanctuary, surrounded by the love of two mothers and a bear who had chosen her family with wisdom that exceeded human understanding. The forest had kept its promise, had protected its most precious gift, and had ensured that love would continue to flow wherever it was needed most. The road ahead stretched toward home, toward Jessica, toward a future filled with the ordinary magic of raising a child who had been touched by something extraordinary. But Connor knew that they would return to the sanctuary, that baby Sarah would grow up knowing about Luna and Sarah Mitchell and the love that had brought them all together. The forest would always be part of their family story, a reminder that the most important connections in life often formed in the most unexpected ways. As the lights of the city appeared in the distance, Connor felt Luna's presence one last time, a sense of approval and blessing that seemed to emanate from the mountains themselves. The bear had kept her promise, had ensured that baby Sarah would be loved and protected, and had created a bridge between the wild world and human civilization that would endure for as long as love itself existed. The whispers of the forest would always be part of their story, calling them back whenever they needed to remember that family, in its truest form, knew no boundaries at all. The years that followed Connor and Jessica's discovery of the sanctuary passed like pages in a book written by the forest itself, each season bringing new understanding of the extraordinary bond that connected their family to the wilderness. Baby Sarah grew into a curious toddler, then a thoughtful child, always drawn to the mountains with an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple preference. By her 5th birthday, she could identify dozens of bird calls, knew which plants were safe to eat, and moved through the forest with a confidence that amazed even experienced hikers who joined them on their regular expeditions to visit Luna and the sanctuary. Connor had returned to full duty as a paramedic, but his perspective on his work had been forever changed by his experience with Luna and the discovery of Sarah Mitchell's story. He found himself more attuned to the subtle signs that indicated when someone needed help beyond what conventional medicine could provide, more willing to listen to the stories that patients told about their connections to the natural world, more open to the possibility that healing could come from sources that medical textbooks never mentioned. His colleagues noticed the change, the way he seemed to bring a sense of peace and understanding to even the most chaotic emergency situations. Jessica had thrown herself into researching everything she could find about human-animal bonds, about cases where wild creatures had demonstrated intelligence and emotional capacity that challenged scientific understanding. Her work had led her to connect with researchers and naturalists around the world who were studying similar phenomena, and she had become something of an expert on the subject of interspecies communication and cooperation. The story of Luna and Sarah Mitchell had become a case study in her presentations, though she was careful to protect the privacy and location of the sanctuary itself. The sanctuary remained exactly as Luna maintained it, a place frozen in time but alive with ongoing purpose. Connor and Sarah visited at least once a month, sometimes accompanied by Jessica when her schedule allowed. Sometimes just the two of them seeking the peace and understanding that only the forest could provide. Luna was always there, sometimes visible and welcoming, sometimes felt but not seen, always watching over the place that had become a bridge between two worlds. During these visits, Connor began to notice changes in Luna that spoke of the passage of time and the weight of her responsibilities. The bear was aging, her movements slightly slower than they had been during those first dramatic encounters, her fur showing touches of gray around her muzzle and ears. But her intelligence remained as sharp as ever, her devotion to the sanctuary and to Sarah's welfare unchanged by the years that had passed since Sarah Mitchell's death. If anything, Luna seemed more purposeful with each passing season, as if she understood that her time as guardian was finite and wanted to ensure that everything was in place for whatever came next. It was during one of their autumn visits, when Sarah was 6 years old, and beginning to ask more sophisticated questions about her origins, that Connor discovered Luna had been preparing for another transition. The bear led them to a section of the sanctuary that had been off-limits during previous visits, an area that Luna had always seemed to guard with particular care. What Connor found there was a workshop, carefully constructed and maintained, where someone had been creating the wooden toys and carved decorations that filled the sanctuary. The workshop was a marvel of ingenuity and craftsmanship, equipped with tools that had been adapted for use by someone with paws rather than hands. Luna had learned to use these tools, had taught herself to carve and shape wood with a precision that rivaled human artisans. The evidence of her work was everywhere: toys in various stages of completion, decorative panels for the sanctuary buildings, and most remarkably, a series of carved tablets that told the story of Sarah Mitchell's family in pictures and symbols. Sarah was fascinated by the workshop, her young mind immediately grasping the significance of what Luna had accomplished. "She makes things for me," Sarah said, with a matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to even the most extraordinary circumstances. "She makes them because she loves me, like Mama Sarah did." Connor watched his daughter examine Luna's handiwork with reverence and understanding, and he realized that Sarah's connection to the sanctuary and its guardian went deeper than he had ever imagined. The carved tablets were particularly remarkable, representing what appeared to be Luna's attempt to create a permanent record of everything that had happened since Sarah Mitchell's death. The images showed the crash, Connor and Jessica's discovery of the sanctuary, baby Sarah's adoption, and the regular visits that had followed. But they also showed scenes that Connor hadn't witnessed, private moments when Luna had cared for the sanctuary alone, maintaining it through harsh winters and blazing summers, always keeping it ready for Sarah's return. One tablet showed Luna teaching other forest animals about the sanctuary's importance, instructing them in ways to help maintain and protect the site. Another depicted the bear gathering materials from throughout the forest, collecting exactly the right pieces of wood and stone needed for repairs and improvements. The tablets revealed Luna as not just a guardian, but as an active manager of a complex ecosystem, someone who understood that preservation required constant effort and adaptation. As Connor studied the tablets, he began to understand that Luna was preparing him for something, sharing knowledge and responsibility that she had previously kept to herself. The bear was aging, and she knew it. Her careful documentation of everything she had done, her detailed instructions carved in wood and stone, were her way of ensuring that the sanctuary would continue to serve its purpose even after she was no longer able to maintain it personally. The realization filled Connor with both honor and trepidation. Luna was asking him to become the sanctuary's next guardian, to take on the responsibility that she had carried alone for so many years. It was a trust that went far beyond anything Connor had ever imagined when he first encountered the bear beside their crashed ambulance. But as he looked at Sarah, saw the peace and understanding that the sanctuary brought to her young life, he knew that accepting this responsibility was not just an honor, but a necessity. Sarah seemed to understand what was happening even better than Connor did. She approached Luna with the confident affection of a child who had never known fear of the massive creature, wrapping her small arms around the bear's neck in a gesture of pure love. Luna responded with the gentle patience she had always shown toward the child, but Connor could see something new in the bear's eyes. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction at knowing that her work would continue, that the sanctuary would remain a safe haven for Sarah and any others who might need its protection in the years to come. Over the following months, Luna's lessons became more intensive and detailed. She showed Connor every aspect of sanctuary maintenance, from the practical matters of structural repair to the more subtle requirements of wildlife management and forest stewardship. The bear had developed systems for everything: water collection and purification, food storage and preservation, weather monitoring and preparation for seasonal changes. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, the result of years of careful observation and experimentation. Most importantly, Luna taught Connor about the network of relationships that connected the sanctuary to the broader forest ecosystem. The bear had established communication patterns with other wildlife, creating a system of mutual support and protection that extended far beyond the sanctuary's physical boundaries. Eagles served as scouts, reporting on weather patterns and human activity. Deer and elk helped maintain trails and clearings. Even smaller creatures like squirrels and chipmunks played roles in the complex web of cooperation that Luna had woven throughout the forest. Connor began to understand that the sanctuary was not just a physical place, but the center of a community, a focal point for relationships and connections that spanned the entire mountain ecosystem. Luna had created something unprecedented, a functioning partnership between human intelligence and animal wisdom, a demonstration of what was possible when different species worked together toward common goals. The sanctuary was proof that the boundaries between human and natural worlds were artificial constructs that could be transcended through understanding and cooperation. As winter approached and the forest prepared for its annual period of dormancy, Connor noticed that Luna's behavior was changing in subtle but significant ways. The bear spent more time at the sanctuary, less time ranging through the broader forest. Her movements were more deliberate, more focused on specific tasks that seemed designed to complete unfinished projects. Most tellingly, she began to spend long periods simply sitting in quiet contemplation, as if she were saying goodbye to places and experiences that had defined her extraordinary life. Sarah noticed the changes too, with the intuitive understanding that children often possessed about the important transitions in their lives. She began to spend more time during their visits simply being present with Luna, not exploring or playing, but sitting quietly beside the bear in companionable silence. These moments of shared peace were profound in their simplicity, representing a form of communication that transcended words or even gestures. Sarah and Luna were saying goodbye in the only way that mattered, by being fully present with each other while they still could. Connor found himself documenting everything during these final visits, taking photographs and making detailed notes about Luna's instructions and demonstrations. He wanted to preserve not just the practical knowledge that Luna was sharing, but the spirit of her approach to sanctuary stewardship. The bear's methods were based on patience, observation, and deep respect for the natural processes that governed forest life. She never forced solutions, but instead worked with existing patterns and relationships, finding ways to support and enhance what was already working well. The lessons extended beyond practical maintenance to encompass the philosophical foundations that had guided Luna's guardianship. The sanctuary existed not to impose human will upon the natural world, but to create a space where human and natural needs could be met simultaneously. Every decision Luna made was evaluated not just for its immediate effects, but for its long-term impact on the delicate balance that sustained the entire ecosystem. She was teaching Connor to think like a forest, to understand that every action rippled outward in ways that might not be apparent for years or even decades. As the first snows of winter began to dust the mountain peaks, Luna led Connor and Sarah to one final location within the sanctuary complex. Hidden beneath the roots of the largest tree, accessible only through a carefully concealed entrance, was a chamber that took Connor's breath away. The underground space was larger than should have been possible, carved from living rock and earth with a precision that spoke of years of patient work. The walls were covered with carvings that told the complete story of the sanctuary, from its earliest conception in Sarah Mitchell's mind through Luna's years of solitary guardianship to the present moment when responsibility was being passed to new hands. But the chamber's most remarkable feature was not its carvings or its hidden location. In the center of the space, surrounded by carefully arranged stones and soft furs, was a nest-like depression that was clearly intended as a resting place. Connor realized with a mixture of awe and sadness that Luna had prepared this chamber as her final resting place, a location where she could spend her last days surrounded by the story of everything she had accomplished and protected. The chamber contained supplies that would last through the harshest winter, along with detailed instructions carved in stone about how the sanctuary should be maintained after Luna's death. There were maps showing the locations of emergency shelters throughout the forest, guides to the seasonal patterns that governed wildlife behavior, and most remarkably, a series of carved portraits showing the faces of every person who had ever visited the sanctuary. Sarah Mitchell, baby Sarah, Connor, Jessica, and even some faces that Connor didn't recognize but who had apparently played roles in the sanctuary's history that he had never learned about. Sarah approached the chamber's center with the solemnity of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. She knelt beside the resting place that Luna had prepared and placed her small hands on the soft furs, her young face serious with the weight of understanding. "This is where you'll sleep when you're tired," she said to Luna, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to life's most profound transitions. "But you'll still be here, won't you? You'll still be watching over everything." Luna's response was a gentle nuzzle against Sarah's cheek, a gesture so tender and full of love that Connor felt tears streaming down his face. The bear was saying goodbye, but she was also making a promise. Her physical presence might end, but her spirit, her wisdom, and her love would remain woven into the fabric of the sanctuary forever. The chamber wasn't just a resting place. It was a shrine to the continuity of love and protection that would outlast any individual guardian. The winter that followed was the harshest in memory, with storms that lasted for days and temperatures that plunged far below normal ranges. Connor worried constantly about Luna, about how she was managing the brutal conditions alone in the sanctuary. He tried several times to reach the forest during breaks in the weather, but the roads were impassable and the risks too great to justify with Sarah's safety at stake. All he could do was trust in Luna's wisdom and preparation, knowing that if anyone could survive such conditions, it would be the bear who had spent years learning every secret the forest had to offer. When spring finally arrived and the roads reopened, Connor made his way to the sanctuary with a mixture of hope and dread. What he found there was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Luna was gone, her physical form no longer present in the places where Connor had grown accustomed to seeing her. But the sanctuary itself was pristine, maintained through the harsh winter with a care that could only have come from Luna's final efforts. Every structure was intact. Every supply cache was full, and new growth was already beginning to emerge from the forest floor with unusual vigor and abundance. In the hidden chamber beneath the great tree, Connor found Luna's final gift. The bear had spent her last days creating one more carving, a masterpiece that captured the essence of everything the sanctuary represented. The carving showed a continuous cycle of love and protection, with figures representing Sarah Mitchell, Luna, Connor, Jessica, and Sarah, flowing seamlessly into one another in an endless pattern of care and guardianship. At the center of the design was a small figure representing baby Sarah, surrounded by all the love that had shaped her life, protected by guardians from both human and animal worlds. Beneath the carving, Luna had left a collection of items that Connor recognized as her most precious possessions. There was Sarah Mitchell's medical bag, carefully preserved and maintained throughout the years since her death. There was the original journal that had started Connor's journey of understanding, along with Luna's own pictorial records of everything that had happened since. Most precious of all, there was a small wooden box containing locks of fur from Luna herself, along with similar mementos from Sarah Mitchell, preserved as tangible connections to the love that had created the sanctuary. Connor understood that these items were not just keepsakes, but sacred objects, physical representations of the spiritual connections that bound the sanctuary's community together across the boundaries of species and time. Luna had prepared them as tools for teaching future generations about the sanctuary's history and purpose, ensuring that the story would be preserved and passed down no matter how many years might pass or how many different guardians might take responsibility for the site. Sarah's reaction to Luna's passing was profound in its simplicity. She grieved, as any child would grieve the loss of someone who had been a constant presence in her life, but she also understood that Luna's influence would continue in ways that death could not touch. "She's in the trees now," Sarah told Connor as they stood together in the sanctuary clearing. "She's in the water and the rocks and the animals. She's everywhere here, just like Mama Sarah is everywhere here. They're both still taking care of us." Connor realized that Sarah's understanding was deeper and more complete than his own. The child had grasped something that adults often struggled to accept, that love, once given, never truly ended, but transformed into something that could touch and influence the world in ways that transcended physical presence. Luna and Sarah Mitchell lived on in the sanctuary they had created, in the lessons they had taught, and in the love they had demonstrated was possible between all living beings. The responsibility of maintaining the sanctuary fell to Connor now, but he discovered that Luna had prepared him well for the task. The systems she had established continued to function smoothly. The relationships she had built with other forest creatures remained strong, and the physical structures she had maintained proved remarkably resilient and self-sustaining. More importantly, Connor found that he had internalized Luna's approach to guardianship, her patient observation and gentle intervention, her deep respect for natural processes and cycles. Sarah became Connor's partner in sanctuary stewardship, her young eyes often catching details that adult perception missed, her intuitive understanding of animal behavior proving invaluable in maintaining the complex web of relationships that Luna had established. The child had inherited more than just a connection to the sanctuary. She had inherited a way of being in the world that honored both human intelligence and natural wisdom, that saw cooperation rather than competition as the foundation for sustainable relationships between species. As the seasons passed and the sanctuary continued to thrive under Connor's guardianship, he began to understand that Luna's greatest achievement had not been the physical preservation of the site, but the creation of a new model for human-nature relationships. The sanctuary demonstrated that it was possible for humans to live in genuine partnership with the natural world, to serve as stewards rather than masters, to find ways of meeting human needs that enhanced rather than diminuted the health and vitality of natural ecosystems. The network of relationships that Luna had established continued to evolve and expand under Connor's care. New animals joined the sanctuary community, drawn by some instinctive understanding that this was a place where cooperation and mutual support were not just possible but expected. Connor learned to communicate with these creatures using methods that Luna had taught him, developing his own ability to read the subtle signs and signals that constituted interspecies communication. Most remarkably, other humans began to find their way to the sanctuary, guided by the same mysterious processes that had brought Connor and Jessica into Luna's circle of trust. These were people who had been touched by extraordinary encounters with wild animals, who had experienced connections that challenged their understanding of what was possible between human and natural worlds. They came seeking answers, seeking community, seeking ways to honor and preserve the relationships they had discovered. Connor welcomed these visitors with the same careful evaluation that Luna had once applied to him. He looked for signs of genuine understanding, of respect for the sanctuary's purpose and methods, of willingness to contribute to the community rather than simply taking from it. Those who demonstrated these qualities were invited to become part of the sanctuary's extended family, learning its secrets and sharing responsibility for its preservation. The sanctuary began to serve as a research center and teaching facility, a place where scientists, naturalists, and ordinary people could come to study and experience genuine interspecies cooperation. Connor and Sarah shared their knowledge freely, but always with the understanding that the sanctuary's primary purpose was not human education, but the preservation of the relationships and wisdom that Luna and Sarah Mitchell had established. As Sarah grew older, her connection to the sanctuary deepened and evolved. She learned to read the forest's moods and seasons with the same intuitive understanding that Luna had possessed, developing her own relationships with the animal community that called the sanctuary home. Most importantly, she began to understand her role as the bridge between the sanctuary's past and future, the living link between Sarah Mitchell's original vision and whatever the sanctuary might become in generations yet to come. Connor watched his daughter's development with pride and wonder, seeing in her the fulfillment of everything that Luna and Sarah Mitchell had hoped for when they entrusted her to his care. Sarah was growing up to be someone who could move seamlessly between human and natural worlds, who understood that the boundaries between species were artificial constructs that could be transcended through love and understanding, who carried within herself the wisdom and compassion that would be needed to guide the sanctuary through whatever challenges the future might bring. The story that had begun with a crashed ambulance and a guardian bear had evolved into something far greater than any of its original participants could have imagined. The sanctuary had become a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed divided between human ambition and natural preservation, proof that cooperation and mutual support were not just possible but essential for the long-term survival and flourishing of all species. Connor often stood in the sanctuary, clearing at sunset, watching the light filter through the trees that Luna had tended with such care, feeling the presence of all those who had contributed to this extraordinary place. Sarah Mitchell's vision, Luna's devotion, his own commitment to stewardship, and Sarah's growing wisdom all flowed together in an ongoing story of love that transcended every boundary that humans thought separated them from the natural world. The sanctuary would continue, Connor knew, long after he was gone, long after Sarah had grown old and passed the responsibility to someone else. The relationships that had been established there, the wisdom that had been accumulated, the love that had been demonstrated, would continue to ripple outward in ways that might never be fully understood, but would always be profoundly felt. The forest had taught them all that love, once given, never truly ended, but transformed into something eternal and ever-expanding, touching lives and hearts in ways that would echo through generations yet to come. As night fell over the sanctuary and the sounds of the forest settled into their evening rhythms, Connor felt Luna's presence one more time, a gentle approval that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves. The bear had kept her promise, had ensured that love would continue to flow wherever it was needed most, had created something that would outlast any individual life but would preserve the essence of what made life worth living. The sanctuary stood as testament to the truth that Sarah Mitchell had discovered and Luna had embodied, that love truly had no boundaries, that family had no limits, and that home was wherever beings came together in mutual care and protection. The whispers of the forest carried these truths on the evening wind, sharing them with anyone patient enough to listen, anyone open enough to believe that the most important connections in life often formed in the most unexpected ways. The sanctuary would continue to teach these lessons to all who came seeking understanding, and the story of love that transcended every boundary would continue to unfold in ways that honored the memory of all those who had contributed to its creation and preservation.